Hi, and sorry for the false start there a second or two ago. Let's just wait for the rest of the committee members to join us, and then I'll reintroduce you. So we're waiting for Judge Henderson, Senator Skinner, and Assemblymember Lee. If you guys could come to your desks, that would be great. All right, I'm gonna get started, and I'm sure that they'll join us and are listening as they get back to their chairs. It's in some ways a great advantage that we've been able to do these hearings by Zoom because it allows us to have a lot of people come, and then of course it has all the logistical issues that we've become accustomed to. And I hope someday we're able to do these meetings in person, at least partially. Thank you all for joining us. So let me reintroduce you. Again, apologies for the false start a minute ago. We'll hear from you in the order that I'm about to introduce you. And again, if you would keep your comments to about 5 minutes, and then we'll leave the rest for question and answer. So first we'll hear from Dr. Gina Rodriguez Castro, who's assistant professor at the University of San Francisco and director of the Survivor Policy at Prosecutors Alliance. Aswad Thomas, who's the national director of Crime Survivors for Safety and Justice. And then Delaney Green, clinical teaching fellow at UC Berkeley Policy Advocacy Clinic. Dr. Rodriguez Castro, we'll begin with you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today. It's my pleasure to talk with you about victims' rights and services and my experience working with survivors of crime. I'm a clinical psychologist and professor at the University of San Francisco in the Graduate Counseling Psychology program, but I'm also a victim advocate and the former chief of Victim Services Division in San Francisco for 7 years. As the director of the Survivor Policy Training and Resource Center for the Prosecutors Alliance, my role is to support the members of the Alliance to work with reform in criminal justice system through smart, safe, modern solutions that advance not just public safety, but community well-being. As the director of the Survivor Center, I work on policy, training, and resources that help survivors of crime heal and recover. We're currently working on 3 pieces of legislation: SB 299, which provides victim compensation for survivors of police violence; SB 1003, which provides a 40-hour trauma-informed training for all advocates who engage with and work with crime survivors; and AB 2103, which proposes a pilot program for a 24-hour crisis response service for crime survivors in San Francisco, Los Angeles, San Joaquin, and Contra Costa counties. The Prosecutors Alliance is committed to victims and survivors and working to develop stronger responses grounded in healing. So the work that we do is around hearing from survivors about things that support and engage them in healing process after crime victimization. Survivors face a range of challenges in the aftermath of a crime event. Violence and crime incidents can cause physical, emotional, social, and financial challenges, preventing them from getting better. Compensation programs allow victims to focus on physical and emotional recovery and less on the financial stress. Compensation covers medical and mental health, funeral, burial, crime scene cleanup, lost wages, relocation, and other vital services. And the process of securing compensation can be confusing and difficult for survivors, especially when they're dealing with the aftermath of trauma. Trying to determine eligibility, understand maximum claim limits, managing the application process, submitting documentation, and negotiating upfront payments, waiting for reimbursement can be overwhelming. Crime compensation is a payer of last resort, so the survivor must exhaust all available resources, including insurance, workman's comp, other employee benefits, paid time off, and any other sources before they're eligible for compensation. Survivors are required to report incidents to law enforcement, except in the cases of human trafficking, domestic violence, and sexual assault, and cooperate with the investigation, usually within the first 72 hours of the crime. Law enforcement determines if the survivor is cooperating based on the crime report, sometimes just moments after the crime happens. Additionally, a subjective assessment of contribution to the crime is determined in that report by law enforcement. For the last 2 years, I've been doing really significant research with crime survivors, 2 studies with over 1,000 crime survivors. The first was the Survivor Impact Study of 2020 that I did while I was at the San Francisco District Attorney's Office. And the second, which has been completed and we're now writing, is called Survivor Voices through the Prosecutors Alliance of California and the University of San Francisco. The primary purpose of this kind of research has been to understand the interactions between survivors of crime and the criminal justice system and how they access or utilize resources to aid in their healing and recovery. This research has really helped us to understand what's working, what's not, and what kinds of things crime survivors think should be changed. In both studies, we've asked survivors about their access and utilization of financial compensation and victimization, which seems to be one of the biggest issues. We've also identified the need for more support on an ongoing basis. They get a lot of support upfront when the crime is reported or is being investigated, and then services seem to drop off. The second thing is that they don't have a lot of information about their rights as a crime survivor. Victims' rights have to be implemented and enacted by the survivor themselves, and they often don't know how to do that or what to do if their rights are not upheld. A third thing is that survivors want advocates to have better training, be more responsive to people who are experiencing trauma, and they want more people with lived experience as advocates working with them. And the fourth identification is that survivors want access to resources for healing and recovery, regardless of who or how they were harmed. And this includes victims' compensation. I've identified a few of the big issues that came out as trends in our research that are related to compensation. So challenges with compensations that were raised by the survivors in this report. And this second report had 763 survivors of crime that responded. And according to the report that was prepared by California Victims Compensation Board for a hearing that I was in on February 7th, they have had decreased claims over the last 4 years and decreased amount of money that they're giving out. Yet we have the same number of crime victims that need support. Denials are down. But we know that there are a lot of survivors that report in our studies that they are not accessing the compensation and using it in order to recover. Many survivors are not aware of Cal VCB and victims' compensation, so they never apply. The Survivor Voices study found that 60% of survivors we surveyed knew about compensation, 40% did not, but 89% of survivors who were informed about it then did apply. So when they have the information, then they utilize the resource. We need more public awareness about the California Victims Compensation Program, offered in multiple formats, languages, and modalities. We can't just rely on the county partners that are providing victim services through District Attorney's Office to educate people about this resource.
I think we've heard a lot about the lack of transparency, the confusion in the various different programs. I think that's very interesting and certainly requires some hard thought and coordination. I think that we'll talk about that further in this panel. So thank you. Mr. Thomas.
Hello, thank you committee members for having me here today, and also thank you to Cal VCB and also my other panelists who are here today. Really have this important conversation. My name is Aswad Thomas. I'm the National Director of Crime Survivors for Safety and Justice, and I'm also a victim of gun violence. When I was shot in 2009, those bullets ended my basketball career. And like many survivors across the state of California and across the country, I was never made aware of the victim compensation program or had any access to victim services. But what really changed my life in my journey in this work was learning about the young man who had shot me. And just like myself, he was a victim of gun violence 4 years prior, who was released back into the same community where I was shot, were not connected to any services or was made aware of the victims compensation program. And I strongly believe that his unaddressed trauma as a 14-year-old young Black man who was shot with no help, I strongly believe that led to me getting shot years later. And so, as I was recovering, I wanted to kind of turn my pain into action in some way. And that's what led me to working with crime survivors for safety and justice. Crime Survivors for Safety and Justice, we are the flagship program of the Alliance for Safety and Justice, also California's for Safety and Justice, where we are a national network of 90,000 crime victims. We have 12,000 crime victims in the state of California who are advocating for what we call new safety solutions and removing barriers to victim services. And CSSJ were founded in California in 2012 because the voices and experiences of crime victims in communities most impacted by violence, are the least supported by the justice system, are the least supported by traditional victim services, are the least supported by the victims compensation program. So we wanted to start this network to really elevate the voices and experiences of survivors. And I think when we talk about compensation, I think California has made significant strides in improving its compensation program. California is a national leader. For the past 7 years, I've traveled the country working with crime survivors, working with legislators, and compensation programs. And California is at the forefront of really enhancing services, but we have a lot of more work to do as well. And so, as we've heard today, that most survivors are unaware of compensation in the first place. I think Senator Skinner mentioned earlier, discriminatory barriers that exist in compensation programs, in policy and law in California and across the country. And, that thought, that idea, who's deserving, who's undeserving. And we see in California and across the country that survivors, especially in communities of color, are being denied access to victims' compensation at extremely high rates as well. And we know that, for me, as a national director, I work across the country. So just wanted to lift up some of the barriers that exist not only in California, across the country, but also want to provide just some recommendations, policy recommendations, where I think California can make to continue removing barriers to compensation. So California currently is this only one of 8 states that have like restrictions to victims compensation for survivors with convictions. So those survivors who are on probation or parole for certain convictions cannot receive support until they are no longer under supervision. That really impacts not only that individual, but also that family as well, who may be seeking support to bury a loved one or access counseling and therapy for a parent or a sibling or a child. So that's one significant barrier. We also know that most survivors who apply for compensation, they never actually receive the full reimbursement that the California program provides. And so there are so many challenges, issues with that reimbursement model for many expenses. It just simply don't work for a lot of crime survivors who don't have the money to pay for emergency costs like funerals or that relocation support. And also what we continue to hear from survivors, I think almost like every day, that survivors just get so overwhelmed with the paperwork. There's like long processing times, and a lot of survivors just become discouraged, and so they just, kind of just give up. They're just fed up with the process, that they're trying to get all of the tax information, job information, police report. A lot of survivors just give up on the process. And a lot of organizations who work with survivors often don't tell victims about the program because of these issues, because it's re-traumatizing survivors when they apply or they hear from another survivor that, hey, I applied and I was never approved for compensation. So as I mentioned, like, California is a national leader. So there are some recommendations that I will have for the state. That includes allowing alternatives to police reporting for all victims of violent crime, and also really ending the denials of lack of cooperation with law enforcement. California already allows alternatives to a police report for survivors of domestic violence or sexual assault or human trafficking. But other survivors, survivors like myself, who's a victim of gun violence and other victim experience, do not have those alternative cooperation practices. In places like New Mexico, Pennsylvania, New York, they do allow for those alternative reporting that doesn't include just a police report, which is very important. The state of California, joins about 42 states that have, eliminated eligibility restrictions for victims who are on probation or parole. Our organization worked directly with the Ohio Attorney General's office and with the Illinois Attorney General's office to remove those restrictions for victims who are on probation or parole. As I mentioned, that provides a significant barrier to the direct victim, but also to the victim's family as well. And
I'm going to interrupt you here just to keep it short, and then we would definitely want to get into these details and especially the specific policy recommendations that you have. Sorry to interrupt you, but I'm trying to keep everybody at about 5 minutes. All right, Ms. Green.
Thank you so much. Well, I'm going to continue with many of the themes that Aswad was just discussing. So this is good. We got it. So first of all, thank you so much to the committee for inviting me today. I'm Delaney Green. I'm with the Policy Advocacy Clinic at UC Berkeley, and I'm also a member of the Debt-Free Justice Coalition. Today, I would like to bring the committee's attention to 3 key items. One is to continue to explore and to quantify that overlap between who is a survivor and folks who are ordered to pay restitution. I'd like to discuss the difference in the penal code between a survivor and who is a victim. And then finally, I would like to just discuss some other documentation and collection practices that could be updated to improve outcomes for folks who are impacted by the system. So many of us have heard the phrase that hurt people, and that is certainly the case when it comes to restitution or victim compensation, as both of these other panelists were just pointing out. But specifically in terms of how often that occurs, in a survey that the clinic conducted last spring, we found that 78% of participants in our study that were paying restitution were also crime survivors themselves, and that's 78%. And within that group, over half of them had never received any restitution or compensation. And as we hear more and more from folks who are paying restitution, we have come to realize that most, if not all, of these folks are indeed survivors of harm themselves, but could not or did not report these incidents to law enforcement. So while we tend to think about what's called the victim offender overlap as being the exception to the rule or occasional, we've actually found it very difficult to identify folks who are paying who have not been on the receiving end of harm in the past. Conversely, we have been able to identify survivors that have never caused harm to others. And it's often exclusively that group of survivors who is given a voice in this conversation. And we would like to change that. Because if those survivors are not adequately and quickly compensated, as we've been discussing, we're not only setting them up for dual victimization, but we're increasing the likelihood that they are going to come into contact with the criminal legal system themselves in the future. So why should attention to this overlap be prioritized for the committee? As you've heard, the current system basically allows you to be one or the other, right? It allows you to be a person paying restitution or a survivor. And a lot of it is because of the eligibility requirements that we see in our programming for victim compensation. Of course, being on supervision for a criminal conviction yourself, but also just having the resources and time and linguistic ability to be able to access all of these things. We are systematically excluding entire groups of people who are most vulnerable and most in need. And these groups, these are the same folks who fall into both of these categories, right? Somebody who is more likely to cause somebody harm, and then somebody who's more likely to be harmed themselves. So my recommendation for the committee is to address those eligibility requirements as a start, but also continue to explore changes to the penal code that could act in more of a preventative way to interrupt the cycle of harm that these folks are experiencing, and to start assisting survivors based upon their need rather than, say, their criminal history. Another important distinction in the penal code is, considering who's a survivor and who is a victim. So currently, insurance companies, hospitals, commercial entities, the Motion Picture Association, and police and fire departments in the statute are considered to be victims. They can be ordered to receive restitution. But in practice, these entities are already collecting premiums or receiving tax dollars or discharging debt as uncollectible. There is a mechanism in place to fund them. And because resources for survivors, and by that I mean people who are enduring harm, their family members or others around them who are impacted by that incident, because those resources are so scarce, I think it's, just a natural step for us to prioritize those folks and to really streamline services to people before we think about how we're going to compensate the Motion Picture Association, right? So finally, I'd like to encourage that the committee also examine and revise some of the collection and documentation requirements that are outlined in the Penal Code, section 2085.5 and 0.6, because currently the means by which we collect restitution is so severe that it's actually undermining efforts to recoup resources for survivors. And so, for example, one woman that I have spoken to, anything that she makes in a month beyond $1,000 in California is being garnished towards the restitution debt that she's been ordered to pay. And as we know, $1,000 a month is not enough to meet your basic needs in this state. And so basically, she has been forced out of work because the cost of childcare is not enough to break even with the severity of her income deduction. And with this system, nobody's benefiting. The survivor is not benefiting from that. She is not. Her children are not. It's a lose-lose for all. So I think there are a couple of adjustments we can make. I'm happy to kind of talk about the policy recommendations specifically. But one just final comment I wanted to make on the last panel, you were asking, who's doing a really good job at this? What is a system that we could try and replicate here? I think, unfortunately, we have to look outside of the United States, because the United States is very penal, and we're considering punishment with victim services, and those two things maybe aren't super well aligned. But the UK and Norway have systems that operate more closely to a universal workers' comp system, which I think is, if anybody in the United States can do it, it's California. So I'd love to talk about those ideas another time, but please let me know if you have any questions.
Not another time.
Okay.
That's very interesting to me.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just going to let you go a little bit further. So explain what you mean by a workers' comp model.
Of course. So actually, the original victim compensation in California actually began as something more similar to universal workers' comp. And it wasn't until the 80s, when we had a big tough on crime and individual responsibility push, that we decided it's no longer part of the social safety net to offer this to survivors. It's the individual's responsibility. And that not only created ruin for folks who were ordered to pay those immoderate sums, but it basically made it so that survivors are the ones who are paying for this ineffective system.
Okay, I just want to understand, before we get into editorializing and what's good and what's bad, can you just sort of explain what this is? This similar to what Mr. Diaz was saying, where the state pays survivors regardless of restitution and just pays survivors, period?
Yes.
Up front. Okay.
Yes. So it's decoupling the restitution part, so the part that is with the person who has caused harm, with the victim compensation, which is for the survivor, right? So it's treating those as two separate systems and saying that anybody who is a survivor of harm is eligible for this compensation, regardless of any other factors beyond the need that they have to try and address that harm.
And let me just stop you there to make sure I understand how it goes. I'm not trying to cut you off. I just want to.
No.
That makes perfect sense to me. But right now, how it goes is, if your victim is able to pay, then you get some of that. But if they are not able to pay, then you don't. Is that correct?
So Dr. Rodriguez might be the.
Yes. Can somebody else answer that question? Senator Skinner, perhaps you know the answer.
Okay, it's a little more complicated, but you can get some payment even if if the crime perpetrator can't pay you, but it's limited, and it can take a long time, and so we've made it very complex.
So, but if the crime perpetrator can pay upfront, a lot of money, then as the victim, you get that much more easily. Is that what we're saying? Very broad strokes?
Yeah, broad strokes, right.
Okay.
And of course, it's not for every crime.
Correct. And what Ms. Green, you were saying in terms of the workers' comp model is we set an amount for harm associated with some crime, you get that period, full stop. And then whether or not we have a restitution program that pays for that with the offender, that's a completely different situation altogether. But the state pays upfront for the harm done. Is that what you're basically saying?
Yeah, I believe that the restitution piece with the person who's caused harm is, of course, a more complicated question because we want to also think about accountability. But in terms of the payout system, the compensation system, it's exactly as you mentioned, it's an upfront payment for those people, which could potentially also include money from individuals. But the key difference is that it is not relying on money from individuals who have caused harm. It is adequately and stably funded.
And Mr. Thomas and Dr. Castro Rodriguez, you basically concur with that. Are we all on the same page here? Okay.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's very hard for survivors to collect restitution, and the ones that do collect restitution usually get a check for between $2 and $5 a month. They'll never pay it. They'll never receive their entire restitution, and it's actually more damaging for them every month to get this tiny amount that means nothing.
So that is a real thing. So that's what Mr. Diaz said. They get checks. Who sends the checks?
It comes from CDCR. So if they're incarcerated in prison, then a portion of their money, either from their books or from their employment, is getting sent to the victim. But some of my survivors get a $2 check or a $1.97 check. And
I look, nobody doesn't want money, but on the other hand, that seems almost insulting and traumatizing and all that business.
Especially since they're still dealing with the aftermath of whatever happened to them physically, emotionally, financially.
Right. And $2 is $2. We're not throwing away money, but at the same time, I appreciate that. Dr. Rodriguez, Castro Rodriguez, there's another thing that you brought up, I think, at the beginning of your talk about this 24-hour hotline. It seems like we've heard today from so many different disparate programs. There's Marcy's Law, there's a Victims Legal Resource Center, there's a Victims Compensation Board, there's CDCR, there's the credits. And is my understanding is your hotline trying to kind of answer all of those questions, or do you see a way that these can all be sort of a one-stop shop? Do you have a suggestion for us about how to make this kind of, and I guess this could go to anybody, but because you raised this, it seems like there's this real information. It seems very complicated. Again, extremely disconnected, complicated, and everybody comes into this traumatized and involuntarily. So is there a way, do you think, that this committee can help try to make some uniformity here, or one-stop shop? Sorry to be so blunt about it, where all this information can be transmitted in a fair, and I forget who the first speaker, I forget who was saying, they're given the actual Marcy's Law, which is not straightforward. It's not, has to be understandable. Not even, forget about the translating in different languages that I think somebody else mentioned and all that, but let's just talk in plain English. It's already difficult enough. Right. So is that the idea of your hotline, or do you have other thoughts about how to make that happen?
Yeah, so it's a 24-hour response. So there would be trained advocates in the counties that we're doing the pilot in that are already trained to respond to this kind of crime, to respond to people in crisis. They would be the keeper of and sort of the coordinator of all that information. Your Marcy's rights, what's happening with the investigation of the case, what's happening with the prosecution of the case, how do you get immediate financial compensation, how do you apply for California victims compensation, and then how do you get referred to community-based organizations. All of those are steps that a crime survivor needs, and they're given that information literally moments after the crime. So most people don't retain that information, don't have anywhere to follow up with it and find out what happens, and the trauma hits them in the middle of the night or late at night or on Saturday when no one is there to respond to them. And literally we have survivors that are like, doing car washes to try to bury their loved one because they have no idea that there's actually a resource they could access that's going to take that off their plate and allow them to work on other things that they have to respond to because of this crime.
So whether or not, so do you think this 24-hour hotline is the solution, or do you have another idea of a way to, again, harness all of these resources, I guess, or?
I think that's one solution. It's a stopgap to try to, because every survivor is different, every jurisdiction is different, the kinds of crimes that happen are different. So I think that will be more responsive immediately. But ultimately, we need to coordinate these services better. We talked about a hotline, but, I was told, well, we already have a domestic violence hotline and a sex assault hotline and a suicide hotline, but those don't respond to somebody that's a gunshot victim or somebody whose, child died because of community violence. There's just aren't resources that really target people who have just had some significant impact because of crime.
And those other hotlines, are those state created? Are they?
They're both. We have state and we have national, and then some local counties also have their own hotlines, human trafficking, domestic violence, those kinds of things.
To make it even more complicated.
Yes.
I mean, I know people are trying to help. I also want to try to acknowledge that everybody here is trying to help. It's just that it seems like a lot of frayed ends.
Right. And when people are not at their best, something horrible has just happened to them, they can't remember 15 different agencies they need to talk to, and they don't even know what they're going to need yet. It's too overwhelming.
Right. That's what I was about to say. I'm sure that you realize days, weeks, months out. So I appreciate.
And then everyone has left. Everyone who came at the very beginning has moved away, and now the trauma is lifting a little so that you see what you need.
Sure.
And can I just interject here just 1 minute? So, like, Gina is bringing up just like the need for just that urgent crisis response to victims. So we, in California, we have, Cal VCB, who funds like Trauma Recovery Center and compensation, other programs. We have Cal ES, who funds a lot of the VOCA funds organizations. But there are just like so many organizations who are at the grassroots level, who are like responding to violence, are helping survivors with their basic needs, immediate crisis support. Like those type of organizations don't have a grant writer, right? We'll never be able to kind of go after local or state funding. And so we need to find a way to kind of really invest in addition to all the other services, like find a way for the state to invest in more in those local community-based organizations who have better access to survivors, right? Who are equipped, who have been doing the work for decades, but often have never been invested in, don't have a lot of resources, and often don't have a building, right? Often don't have transportation to help survive, but as Gina said, are car washes, right? Fish fries, and to help bury loved ones or to get support survivors. I think that is a missing piece, not just in California, but across the country. It's like really investing in those local organizations who've often been founded by a survivor out of their direct experience. I just want to lift up how important that will be as part of this conversation as well.
And Mr. Thomas, can you also talk about this reimbursement model? Does that make sense to you, or do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I think California is like there's like 8 other states who would like find a way to replace fines and fees, as that revenue for survivors, and replace it with general fund revenues to fund compensation programs as well, because we're penalizing survivors, right? But also individuals who are causing harm often come from low income communities, don't have the resources. But I think we just have to think broadly about how do we fund things like compensation outside of restitution and like fines and fees.
So are you saying those 8 other states are more along I'm pointing to different ends of my computer screen because that's where you guys are sitting. But so are you saying that those 8 other states, and we'd love to, you don't need to rattle them off here, but we'd love to get more information, operate more along the lines that Ms. Green was saying, where there is a state pays some level of compensation, and then how the money's collected, that's a separate issue altogether. Is that what you're basically saying?
Yep. And I think what's important, like direct cash assistance, like with
Tell me.
like homicide increasing across the country, we just need to get resources out the door. I think that's where California could be a national leader as well, and like using those general appropriations to fund victims compensation is important as well.
So general cash assistance as opposed to paying for funeral expenses and opposed to mental health treatment. And
yes,
because again, I know that there are other crimes like rape and murder, but to get back to my cell phone example, generally my cell phone's not being replaced, but I might get mental health treatment as a result. Is that right?
Right.
Yeah.
And then the caps on those things don't really cover the expense. And so it's really more like a coupon than it is helping to access the thing that you need to recover. So if you only get $5,000 for a funeral, but it's really 10,000 and you can't afford the other 5,000 anyway, that doesn't really help you. Or you get $2,000 to move, but it's going to cost $7,000 to move. That doesn't help you. So then people just don't take the resource at all.
Right. Do other folks have questions? So I forget who was talking about, maybe it was Mr. Thomas, about the number of people who are excluded. We're talking about number of people who are excluded from receiving or ineligible from receiving compensation because they're on parole or probation or some other exclusion criteria. Do we have any sense of the percent or the number of California's overall crime victims who are excluded because they're on some sort of supervision or ineligible for one of these other reasons?
I don't think we have an accurate number on that because they wouldn't even be allowed to apply for it. And then most people that know that they're not going to apply then don't even go through the paperwork, giving all of their information. It's quite a lengthy process to apply. So it's not an easy process. So people are not going to do it if the likelihood that they're going to be denied is high.
Ms. Green or Mr. Thomas, do you guys have different, Ms. Green? You're nodding your head.
Yes, yeah. It's not going to completely capture this number, but I think a better way of getting closer to that number is to inquire with Cal VCB, not only their denial rate or how many applications are denied, but how many applications are prevented from being started by their staff because of eligibility or are discontinued mid-application, because there's a huge difference between what's denied and what doesn't go through for other reasons other than denial. I want to say the ballpark figure in their previous annual reports was close to 50,000 applications that did not get completed, but denial rates were only in the 4,000 range. So you'd have to check with them, and that was from a couple of years ago, so that might not be the case anymore, but good place to start.
We can get the data of denials because that we can get. But some of the studies, and there have been some recently, would indicate that 4 out of 5 crime victims in California receive no help.
Whoa, okay. Receive no help because they don't know or they're ineligible or we don't?
I mean, obviously, okay, first off, you have a certain set of crimes independent of not just counting the people who might be in parole or incarcerated or what have you that might be excluded or various. You also have a set of crimes that are excluded. So now if I took those out, then the number would change. But if you take all crime victims in California, only 1 out of 5 are getting some kind of help. 4 out of 5 are not. And
Senator Skinner, I know that you're not on the stand here, but I'm going to take this opportunity. This is a budget issue. Is this the reason why we're constraining the number of people? And
it's not only a budget issue. It's to fix it in any of the variety of ways that have been recommended, will take more funds from, the general fund that you can't. We've known for many years, even with the system we now have, that the way we funded it through criminal fees, through various court, that we have not adequately funded it for years. So we've been backfilling it with general fund, and that's just to do what we're doing right now. If we wanted to do anything in the order of what's been discussed in either this panel or the previous panel, we would have to allocate a lot more money. My bill, for example, I haven't run a number on it yet, but it would require a general fund expenditure.
And your bill would eliminate some of these exclusionary criteria, is that correct?
it would do a lot of things. It would streamline, it would change the application process. It would streamline the way to get it. It would eliminate some of the obstacles. But I've also, just from the conversation so far, thought of some other things that we should consider putting in it, like the way we inform, the information we provide the crime victim, and various things like that that would be useful.
Yeah, no, I've learned a ton today for sure. Getting back to my question, in which everybody said it's very difficult to answer, but you guys are the experts. And if you don't want to say, you don't want to say, but is it 10% of eligible people are excluded because of these exclusionary criteria?
Let's put it this
Half.
way, Mike. Let's put it this way. You can't even do a guess, but you look, if you look at who, if we take violent crime, the data we know of who's more subject to violent crime, it is in our Black and brown communities. And they are also the ones who are more subject to being system impacted. And so if a barrier is that you were a previous, if you had a previous felony, or if you are under supervision, or any number of things like that, then you can just extrapolate that you're already excluding a good number of people who then then are survivors of crime themselves. Even
And
past
any previous conviction is an exclusion?
certain ones, yes,
And
And
then if you're
crime-
a parole probation, you're excluded.
correct.
And just to lift up, in California, there are 300,000 people that are on probation or parole, right? And so if you look at, once again, we're going, as it relates to crime victims, we're going off of crimes that are reported to the justice system. There's a large number, it's probably about 40% of crimes goes unreported to law enforcement or unreported to the justice system at all, right? So we're just leaving out so many survivors who aren't, even get in contact with the justice system, who is not getting compensation or victim service at all, because it's just not reported. There's just not a lot of great data on, who's not getting it, because a lot of people, don't apply for it.
No, and at the outset, when I kick this things off, nationally, the U.S. Department of Justice estimates that 50% of crimes aren't reported. So that leads me to another issue that I think mentioned, which was, does this need to be triggered by a police report, which a lot of people are reluctant to file for a variety of reasons, some good, some bad. I won't lie to judgment. What is a good model for triggering compensation outside of a police report? Is it a doctor's note? I assume or is it you just walk in and say, I was a victim of crime, no, I didn't report it, and give me money? What are good models for doing that?
We actually have a model in California. We already use it for human trafficking, domestic violence, and sexual assault. You can have a letter from a community provider, a community-based organization that's providing you services. You can have a letter from a medical provider or a mental health provider. And so you're accessing some resources to try to recover or to get immediate assistance. And that's how we document that you were harmed in this incident. I also just wanted to go back to the percentage. I can give you a percentage for San Francisco.
Okay.
The last year that I was there, 2020 full year, I did an annual report, as I do every year. We served 8,200 victims of crime, and we processed 824 applications. That means only 824 people out of those 8,000 met the criteria to apply for victims' compensation. We had to create another pot of money to compensate some of those people that needed immediate resources, but we just don't have enough to fill the need. So
And all of those 8,000 were crime victims.
all of them were crime victims, and only 824 of them qualified to even just apply. And our denial rate was somewhere around 4 or 5%. So not all of them received compensation. So we're missing the vast majority of people harmed by violence and crime.
And what? And so, is there a big of that large? Is there a big chunk about why they're not eligible?
Yes. So there's three things. It's contribution. So if they were doing anything that's related to the crime, they got into a car with a drunk driver, they were jaywalking, they were engaged in a fight with someone and they got harmed, they would not qualify. Another one is reporting. Did they report it to the police? And then cooperation. Did they cooperate? And cooperation is subjective. We've had people disqualified because they were literally being worked on by first responders and wouldn't answer police questions. And so they were deemed on the police report non-cooperative. Family members were asked questions. Did you know that your loved one knew this person, or is there anybody that was after them? And they would say, I have no idea. I'm focused on what's going on here right now. That's non-cooperative. And then the third thing is just that they don't qualify because they don't have proof of the crime, or, you know, they didn't report it right away. You have to report within 72 hours. And for things like, you know, especially interpersonal trauma, people don't report that for a very long time because they're managing the trauma around it.
So, and are those would you say that those are the big buckets of why people are not? I'm sure that there are many,
My
many
experience,
reasons,
yes.
but again and again, all right. That's super helpful and interesting. Anybody else have any questions? So it seems like, to summarize again, what we've just been talking about are barriers and exclusionary criteria that exclude apparently a large number, perhaps a majority or a vast majority of people, ways to report crimes and that don't have to go through police, and then the workers' comp, what I'll call workers' comp style model, to avoid relying on the offender's ability to pay, but instead having the state compensate somebody, which is something that, again, came up of our very first panel. And apparently, and again, Mr. Thomas, you say several other states already do some version of this. Is that right? All right, we'd love to follow up on that. And then, of course, all of the frayed ends and the 24-hour hotline, and how to try to find some sort of organization and coordination around that. Not just from the state actors, but Mr. Thomas, you highlighted that there are obviously community actors as well, which, like I said, everybody's trying to do good, but the more services that are out there, it almost becomes more overwhelming and even harder. I can imagine in my own life. It's just, all right, this is all extremely helpful. Unless anybody has any questions, I'd like to take a 10-minute break, and then we'll move on to our third panel for today. All right, thank you all very much. Like I said before, no good deeds goes unpunished. We'll be in touch, I'm sure. All right, have a good one. Let's reconvene at, let's make it 4 o'clock even. Please come back to your computers. 13 minutes or so. I'm so sorry. I said to reconvene at 4 o'clock. I meant 3:30.
3:30.
Thanks for correcting that. I was about to
Yeah,
say,
I was
that
just
would be a
looking at-
long, good break.
I'm sorry. I'm a taskmaster. Everybody has to come back to class at 3:30. My bad.